Very good. So we are now here for our first interview in the 73 Amherst Speak series. David Brown, I'm going to turn the floor to you. You can please unmute. David Freudenthal, if you would also unmute, you will be available for this interview. Take it away, Davids.
Great. Thank you very much, Jim. And thanks for being the technology guru of this. This is a bit of an experiment, and I'm very grateful to Dave Freudenthal for being the first subject of it. The purpose of these interviews, there's going to be one every 3 months until the reunion, which is going to be in the spring of 2023. We hope that they will not only be interesting in their own right, but convince people to come back to the interview, because this is sort of our last big hurrah at the college, probably. With that, I think we're going to just dive right in, since we've got more than 50 years to cover. So Dave is speaking from his home in Cheyenne, Wyoming. He was a 2-term governor of Wyoming, the last Democrat to win statewide office there, as was mentioned in a couple of the notes to you, 2003 to 2011. So Dave, why don't we start off with you telling us a little bit about your childhood, your family, where you were born, where you grew up.
I was born in Thermopolis, Wyoming, which is in the northwest portion of the state. Grew up in agriculture, 7th of 8 kids on I guess what people would call a hard scrabble place. But it was a great way to grow up. I mean, you do everything from work cattle to gather eggs, and I enjoyed it. Went to high school there, and obviously graduated.
What was the history of the farm or the ranch, and what were the chief sort of cash crops of it?
Yeah, it was the original part of it was homesteaded by my grandfather, and then over time, my father and grandfather added to it particularly during the 30s, when you had a fairly serious depression and a lot of land became available through tax liens. It was about 5,600 acres, which is a small place in Wyoming. It's a dry country, a high plains desert, best way to characterize it. Cash crops were for grocery money. We raised chickens and sold eggs and potatoes. And for the cash crop that you sold in the fall, it was usually hogs, cattle, or sheep, depending on the variations of the egg market at the time. And you just sort of adjusted to it.
Did either of your parents go to college?
No, my father graduated from high school. My mother did not. They married in 1933 in the middle of the Depression, and they were both from that area and made their life there.
Did your older brothers and sisters go to college?
6, 5 of the 6 older ones did. Most of them really went to college after they'd started a career. Our circumstance was, if you're going to college, you either had to earn the money or get a scholarship. And so some of them went out, earned money, and then went to college.
Did you work on the farm pretty much every day from, 5 on up?
Yeah, I usually started before 5. I mean, sort of the way those things work is when you're younger, you do things with, you do them with your mother. Everything from tend the garden to butcher chickens to gather the eggs and bring in the coal and the fuel oil for the house. And as you got older, then you moved on to things that you did with your father. And then eventually you just did it on your own. So you did everything from, I don't know, bale hay to cut hay to brand cattle. I mean, it was just whatever needed to be done, you did.
When you were in high school, what time did you get up in the morning?
Oh, I suppose around 6. And then, you had a certain set of chores you had to do. Then you got ready and then you went and met the bus and rode the bus to school.
And how far from the school did you live?
Actually, it wasn't too bad. It's about 6 miles. But I got to tell you, I walked home, I walked to school back and forth every day. It was uphill and in the snow.
I've heard about that.
Yeah, it was rough.
So when you were in high school, were you the fair-haired boy and the top of the class, president of the class, most likely to succeed, etc.?
Yeah, all of that, and president of the state student council group and all of that. It was an interesting way to grow up in that being smart as a boy wasn't exactly the most didn't necessarily endear you to everyone. I mean, this was kind of future farmer country, cowboys and that. But notwithstanding that, my father motivated us and my mother a lot to get good grades and go to college. I really credit them with that.
Did you know anyone who had gone to Amherst College before you got around?
No, I hadn't even heard of it.
So how did you hear of it?
It's kind of it sort of reflects the serendipity of life. I was walking down the hall one day and in my senior year, doing applications and that, and the superintendent of schools came out, threw an application for Amherst at me and said, look, fill this out. And the way he knew about Amherst was that his daughter had married a fellow who named Jim Chalmers, who was a adjunct professor, I think, at Amherst in economics. And I filled it out and sent it in along with a number of others. And at the end of the day, the choice of Amherst was essentially a financial choice. I got the best aid and loan package from there. And so kind of sight unseen, went to the airport and flew out there, landed in Springfield.
So you had you ever set foot in Massachusetts before you got?
No. It was, you just make a conscious decision that, obviously it had a great reputation. I think I benefited from geographic distribution because I think the last person from Wyoming had graduated from there a couple of years before I applied. It was just fundamentally a financial decision, and that's how I ended up there.
Were you scared leaving home and going so far away?
I wasn't exactly tickled. It's a significant change of the environment and a significant change in just sort of the perception, but also, at that age, you're a bit excited about the idea of a new adventure.
Mm-hmm. Do you recall any of your first impressions of the place?
They in those days, remember they had that, but they broke us into groups of 8 and everybody, that was supposed to help us get adjusted to college life. And I think it was 1 hour. It struck me in the first meeting that when everybody was talking about how they spent their summers, I was the only one who spent my summers, frankly, working with my hands. I grew up in a culture where people made their living by what they could do and what they could physically perform, as opposed to anything else. And so that's what I did the summer before I went to Amherst, and I got there and people were talking about their exciting experiences of the summer. And I thought, well, hell, I spent my summer pouring cement on concrete bridges. And it was fine.
And you worked while you were at Amherst too.
Yes, I worked in the dining hall, the library, I think they had a limit of 15 hours that you could work on that work study, but the secretary of the financial aid office worked it out so that I had 2 of them. And then I worked at the kitchen in Valentine and got to be friends with some of the townies. And so on the weekends, we'd go out and chop hardwood and then bring it into town and sell it.
Just as firewood?
Yes, firewood. Mhm. We didn't have a lot of hardwood in Wyoming, so learning to split hardwood was a little different than pine.
And what sort of work did you do in the summer?
Generally construction. I spent 1 summer in DC as an intern for one of the Wyoming senators, but generally it was construction work. I got into the Boilermakers Union, which is they build water tanks, oil tanks, and water towers all over the country. And so I worked in 1 summer, I think I worked in 5 different states. There was a crew of us, and we just moved from job to job working for Pittsburgh, Des Moines Steel.
Wow, was that hard or dangerous work?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, it was hard work. I mean, yeah, but it was great work. You worked 6 10s, 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, and you got double time for overtime. So, and you got per diem, so you could bank a fair amount of money. I mean, you worked hard for it, and particularly, I was the only one on the crew who was in college, so I took a lot of grief from the old guys. But you know, it's hard work. I mean, it qualifies as extra hazardous work because you're off the ground almost all the time, and you're relying on. I mean, you build your own scaffolding and you weld and do a lot of chipping. But it was work.
You mentioned in one of our previous conversations that on one of the jobs, there was an accident in which someone was killed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were building a water tower for a municipality, and there was 4 of us on that particular crew, and we we're building what's called a self-supporting roof, which is a roof that until you weld in the last piece, you're dependent on essentially a crane to hold them in place. And the friend of mine and I, we've got to be friends that summer. We're going back and forth welding the pieces, and we were taking turns. And on his turn, the CAT operator, the crane operator, let off with a piece of steel too fast, and then it went down with him and killed him. And it was difficult. I mean, we had to get the steel off of him and then put him in a truck and get him to the hospital. And then I had to go back and get his wife. And you know, you've got her husband's blood on you when you go to get her, but you had to do it, and it needed to be done, so I did it.
You know, you can hardly go a day without hearing about trauma and meaning psychological trauma. But back then, it wasn't talked about that much, and it wasn't really processed in a systematic way. How did you handle that, and how is it if it did?
I mean, it shaped some attitudes that I have. And when I was governor, I got a chance to act on those attitudes in terms of increasing the level of enforcement on oil rigs and mines and stuff from OSHA and MSHA. And you know, it sticks with you. I think at that point in time, what people did was compartmentalize it, and so you sort of wall it off. But you know, it's like most of those things. Periodically, it resurrects itself.
So when did you majored in economics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
you mentioned that you'd been in sort of student governance in high school. Did you know early on, or sort of suspect early on, that you wanted to go into politics at some point?
No, I mean, I decided I want to be a lawyer when I was in 5th grade. And I liked economics, so that's what I got my degree in. And when I came back to Wyoming, I got involved in I needed to pay off my loans from Amherst. So I went to work, and through that course, I eventually got involved with a fellow who served 3 terms here as governor, a crotchety old, Silver Star Marine from World War II, great guy. And I ran a number of his campaigns, and the one thing I didn't want to do was be in politics. I mean, I loved the data, I loved the polling, I loved the sort of how do you put a campaign together, but always viewed myself as the backroom guy, not the candidate.
Interesting, interesting. So presumably you could have gone to a law school other than the University of Wyoming Law School.
That's right.
Did you want to go back because you saw that as useful in sort of confirming your Wyoming bona fides, or did you simply want to go home and get back to the wide open spaces?
I mean, I think it. I mean, I got 2 things out of Amherst. One was a great education, and the other was I really didn't want to live in the East, and I wanted to. The way I grew up, you end up with a certain affinity for the land, and I think people do wherever they grow up. I mean, I don't think it's limited to here. So when it came time to go to law school, I got into some other places, but when I looked around at the way the business functioned in the state, you needed the sort of in-state connections in order to, I think, build a successful practice. And so I chose to go to the University of Wyoming. Plus, the University of Wyoming, the fellow I worked for, who was governor, I was the director of planning, and he was a lawyer, and he knew I wanted to go to law school. And he said, look, if you go to law school and you get on law review, you can come back to work. And that was before they had the attendance policy at law school. And so I went over, got on law review, did my shtick, and then essentially worked full time for him while I was in law school, except the first semester. He said, look, you can't work the first semester. And so that's how it sorted out.
And you did that because you needed the money, or it was just more interesting being in the mix in the governor's office?
Yeah, a little of both, but let me say the financial requirement was perhaps most paramount.
Interesting. So you were eventually appointed United States Attorney by President Clinton.
Right.
Tell me about that. Why did you want to be a U.S. attorney?
Yeah, I've been in private practice for about 14 years, primarily civil. I'd done some criminal representation for defendants, because that's back in the days when, the judge called you up and said, well, Dave, wouldn't you like to represent? And, it's before we had public defenders. And so you took whatever you got. And I wasn't exactly a brilliant defense lawyer, but, I enjoyed it. And I was at a point where I kind of wanted to try something different. And I had not been a Clinton supporter, but I was friends and helped elect the governor who was a Clinton supporter. And that's how I got to be U.S. attorney. I'd have to say that I was probably not the most qualified prosecutor in the state, but I knew somebody who knew Bill Clinton, and I got to be U.S. attorney.
So what was it like going after bad guys for year after year?
I actually think U.S. attorney is the best legal job you can have, although my wife would argue being a judge is better. I never wanted to be a judge because I have little desire to be impartial. The great thing about the U.S. Attorney's Office is you always felt like you were on the side of the angels. And, we dealt with kind of 2 categories of crime. We had lots of drugs, guns, pedophiles, and all of the usual stuff. but we also had jurisdiction on the Wind River Indian Reservation, which meant everything that was above, anything that approached a felony is investigated by the FBI and then prosecuted through the U.S. Attorney's Office. And that brought us into much more of the daily work of a prosecuting attorney in a city or a county in the terms of child sexual abuse, murder, violent crimes. We had a few of those that were off the reservation that were carjacking cases, that were murder cases that we tried. But I thought it was interesting experience. It's a little frightening to realize the government's power in terms of what you can do with a grand jury, and what you can find out, and a lot of which you didn't want to know about. Particularly, it's such a small state that you ended up prosecuting people you knew.
Did you try many of the cases yourself?
I tried to try about 2 or 3 cases a year, but I didn't suffer from the need to be sort of the hot dog. I mean, we had some great trial lawyers. Our drug lawyers were good. We had a really good electronic crimes, particularly on internet porn and what they call travelers cases in terms of pedophilia. And, one thing you need to do in life is if somebody can do it better than you do, it doesn't hurt to be second chair part-time.
Mm-hmm. So
and they were good at it.
Excuse me?
I just say, these were good lawyers and they were fun to be around. I enjoyed a lot of the what's called proffers, where you bring them in and they try to spin their story to you. It was a fascinating education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure. So when and why did you decide to run for governor, which I understand was your first run at elective office?
Yeah, it was. Well, I finished my term as U.S. attorney. I didn't like the direction the state was going. And I thought, well, hell, it'll take me a year to build back up a practice. So why don't I just take a year out and run for governor and have my say about what I think the state ought to look like. And, everybody expected that a Democrat wouldn't win. I mean, the registration here is about 70-30 in terms of the party distribution, with a really small set of independents. And so, I got into the race. People don't exactly fund generously. You don't get a lot of money from the mineral boys when you're a Democrat. And the national party was useless. I mean, they tend to write off these kind of races and flyover country. So it was mostly shoe leather and door to door, and just meeting people. Right. Of course, you had to start out by saying, I know I'm a Democrat, but I'm not an East Coast or West Coast Democrat.
So what direction or directions was Wyoming going in that you were unhappy about?
Well, I don't want to disparage my predecessor, but my view was that the state had tilted too far in the direction of we'll take development at any cost. And I wanted to correct that, because it seems to me that the fundamental proposition in a place like this has to be, people need a job and you need to respect that. But part of the reason they live here is so they can enjoy the great outdoors. And so you don't want to compromise, air quality or the land or the rest of it, and water. And so that was what I set out to do.
So you mentioned that you had worked for a governor right out of
Right. Yeah.
And I believe he was Governor Ed Hirschler.
Right. Right.
And he's a little bit, his story is a little bit like yours. attorney, grew up on a ranch, and he had on his painted on the door of his office, Governor Ed or Gov Ed, which you ultimately had on your office, Gov Dave, and in fact on your official portrait that was unveiled a year and a half ago, you can see you're standing in front of the door with Gov Dave on it. So was he a bit of a model or mentor, or was there something specifically you learned from him that you found very practical in being the governor?
Yeah, what I learned from him was, you just need to talk to people and try to figure out where they're coming from. You can't lead people if you think you're Diogenes walking along the shore with a lantern looking for an honest man. You got to start where they're at, and the way you figure out where they're at is sit down and talk to them. And sometimes you can move them, sometimes you can't. But the other thing I learned from him is you make a decision and you live with it. I guess the way I describe it is you decide what you think's right and what you want to do, and then you think about the most politically astute way to do it. But you separate out your decision about what you think is right from what you think is the political tactic to get it done.
So what were the 2 or 3 things that you wanted to get done when you actually became governor, and were you able to do them, or did the list change dramatically during your tenure?
Well, remember, I had a legislature that was more than 2/3 Republican. So although generally they sustained my vetoes, but what I wanted to do is to strengthen the sort of environmental protection side of the government. I wanted to set aside money to preserve sort of the land and water resources, which we got that done through something called the Natural Resource and Wildlife Trust. I wanted to, Nancy and I, my wife, we took on this question about early childhood intervention, and that became really controversial because you get all of that. Dave and Nancy want to raise our kids, and my response to that was, I didn't enjoy raising mine that much. I don't want to raise yours, but I do think it's important we set up those sort of early testing regimes. We tried to underwrite training for childcare facilities. We were able to get some pre-K programs going, but they didn't really last. And then the way the state works is more than half of the surface is controlled by the federal government, and about 70% of the mineral reserve is owned by the federal government. So you spend a lot of time fighting with the feds. And the way I describe it is when the Democrats are in, they want to turn us into a national park. And when the Republicans are in, they want a drilling rig in every front yard. And we want a little of both. We want the opportunity for people to have jobs, but we also really don't want to screw up the way we live. And so a lot of the time was spent trying to figure out how that balance could be struck in a way that was frankly workable towards both objectives.
So how did you thread that needle? Was there sort of a strategy that involved your personality, or was it basically log rolling and compromising?
I didn't do a hell of a lot of compromising. I wasn't real good at that. What it really is digging into it enough. The feds would do an environmental impact statement, and then we'd go in and argue with them about which tilt went too far. And usually we were successful in getting a little better reclamation standards. But at the same time, it's an oil and gas state, and one of the things we lacked was pipeline takeaway capacity, because we're essentially an export state. So we worked on getting more pipelines so that you ended up having the capacity to have an economy, but also regulate its impact. We had quite a few fights with the industry over everything from air quality standards to where you could put a facility, but it, on balance, it worked out okay.
Did you find that your sort of not getting your back up, but getting sort of using a little humor like you did when in the anecdote about the funding kindergarten and stuff like that, is that what made the difference, or did you convince a lot of people sort of on the merits?
Some of it was on the merits, but some of it was understanding words that they were comfortable with. When we did the Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust, a lot of people were opposed to it because they were convinced that it was really some Sierra Club plot. So you had to get them to understand that what you were talking about, for instance, with conservation easements, that really the conservation easement didn't keep them from running their cattle. They just couldn't run the ground. They couldn't overgraze it. And so a lot of it is just working through the details, because words have become such flashpoints that you have to be careful about explaining what you mean, as opposed to letting them categorize what you say by the words you choose to utilize. I mean, if you say to somebody in Wyoming, well, that climate change is a hell of a problem. Well, climate change is, for about half of the population, is a bad word. If you talk to them about the fact that invasive weeds have gone nuts, water patterns aren't what they used to, it's hotter than it used to, they will agree with you right to the end. And if you say we ought to do something about it, then yeah, they'll agree with that. But if you say we ought to do something about climate change, the wall goes up and the conversation ends. So it's why, if you talk about adaptation to water shortage, people get that. If you talk about adaptation to climate change, that's a little harder to sell.
Yeah, it's a little bit like on the Chesapeake Bay on the eastern shore of Maryland, and particularly in the islands, the two inhabited islands in Chesapeake Bay. You talk about sea level rise, and most people don't believe it. You talk about the problem of erosion, line erosion, and man, they're all over that. They agree that that's their biggest threat, to their livelihood out there.
You'd ask whether things were different than I expected when I became governor. The biggest difference was that the country was at war, and we had an awful lot of guardsmen who were deployed in the Mideast, and that was not something I expected, because that it was essentially new. So I ended up, I tried to make every deployment and every return. Some of them, they'd leave at 3 a.m, but it was important to me that I be there. And the worst part of that was that we ended up burying 21 people. And you go there and you meet with the families and you do what you can, but that's where you discover that words don't fill a vacuum. They got small children, and it's even to this day, it's still a troubling thing. But I did what I could, and did the best I could, and supported the Guard, and we created programs to help the families of the soldiers who were deployed. And the problem was that it went on so long that people ended up, they'd be deployed once, and most guardsmen would figure that's the only time they're ever going in their lifetime. And 18 months later, they'd get deployed again. Right now, people get a 1.5 year notice about being deployed. Then it was like 5 weeks. And then we had to do some things with employers who, to make sure they kept the jobs for them for when they came back. But it was an experience I had not anticipated about being governor.
Wow. So Wyoming is, the biggest coal producer, really an energy commerce economy. What does the future look like to you? We're certainly the Democratic Party and much of the world wants to get rid of, coal, fossil fuel, and Wyoming is right at one end of the bell curve of sort of
Oh, yeah.
dependence on fossil fuel and coal. What is it? Can you thread, or can someone thread that needle?
I think so. I mean, I think the easiest way to explain it is probably 65 to 68% of governmental revenues in Wyoming are derived from fossil fuel production through severance taxes, property taxes, and associated activity. The state's coal production, I think, peaked at 456 million tons in the mid 2000s. That's dropped ever since. But my view about it is that I'm not against the notion that we got to figure out what we're going to do with fossil fuels. I think that the problem is people have a notion that it's a much quicker transition than it's going to turn out to be. And if you look at consumption numbers in terms of what this country, and more importantly, what the rest of the world consumes, you're going to have some form of significant technological breakthrough on two sides. One is better control of the utilization of fossil fuels. And I think coal is naturally going to go away, in part because at least steam coal, now not metallurgical coal, but steam coal, largely because of the age of the power plants. Most of them were built in the late 60s through the 70s. Probably the last major coal plant built in America was probably in, I don't know, probably in the 90s or early 2000s. So that's going to take care of itself, in part because it just makes no sense to replace those plants with another coal plant. On the consumption side, on oil and gas, unless we figure out some way to store the intermittent power that comes from solar and wind, and Wyoming has a lot of wind industry. I mean, this is one windy place, and a fair amount of solar, but that you've got to figure out how you're going to integrate that into the grid so that it can become the major source as opposed to a minor source. In spite of all of the hoorah that's gone on, renewables, particularly if you exclude hydro, are a relatively small contribution to the grid. And I think it's the problem I have with where the Democrats go is that they're not thinking about you can't just flip a switch and automatically it happens just because it's an aspirational goal. There are a hell of a lot of steps that gotta go. And I think there's some things that they're doing that I think make pretty good sense. I think the subsidies for electric vehicles and some of that, I think trying to build out charging stations is a great idea. I mean, if you think about it, it's 350 miles across Wyoming. Interstate 80 probably carries as much truck freight as any highway in the country. And you've got to figure out how you're going to fuel that and how you're going to charge it. I mean, it is a mechanically difficult question that requires a lot less breastfeeding on both sides. Fossil fuels need to be taken care of. Renewables, got to figure out some other way to make it work. Hydrogen's an interesting option. There are quite a few people working on that. But some of it's just marketing and the way people are handling it. But I think it's doable. I think there's a place for Wyoming to have an economy in that, but it'll require the state to stop thinking fondly of the 1990s and 1980s and start thinking fondly about what the state could be in the future.
Mm-hmm.
But then, I'm kind of a redneck. And I'm okay with that.
I have many questions, but there's two that I want to ask you before we get to other people's questions.
Mhm.
If you had two pieces of practical advice, and you've perhaps answered this, but I'd like to hear you reiterate it, to give an incoming governor of any state, not specifically of Wyoming. What would those two pieces of advice be?
Well, one piece of advice would be, don't take yourself so damn seriously and actually listen to people. And the other is, take a longer view about what you want to do with your life and not worry about getting reelected. When I ran the first time, we barely won. And I figured I was living on borrowed time anyway in this state. We got reelected with 70% of the vote, carried all 23 counties, which nobody had done before. But we did it because we didn't think about getting reelected. And I think right now, the obsession with having a political life versus the Jeffersonian model of, the yeoman leaves his plow, does his public service and returns to his plow, I think is a much better model.
Which actually sort of is what my second question is about, in that, as you noted, you won your re-election campaign with 70% of the popular vote, which is pretty incredible. In 2020, 70% of the popular vote in Wyoming was for President Trump. And that was the highest percentage of any state in the union.
Right.
So my question is, did you have some secret sauce? And if you do, are you willing to franchise it? Or were these simply two different eras that just happened to be very close together?
I don't think the eras were fundamentally different. I think I think that the Democrats have largely, from my perspective, become kind of a coastal urban party. And, part of it's built around guns and all of that, but part of it is built around an inability to talk to people about what they talk to their spouse about at dinner. Most people are more concerned about how their kids are doing in school, whether somebody's taking care of their parents, whether they're paying their bills, and the sort of grand rhetoric about we're going to reshape America. I think people are more worried about how they pay their damn bills. If you think about our hierarchy of values, we're fundamentally a child of God, then we're a spouse and a parent and all the rest of that. Then somewhere down there's your career, and way below that ought to be your politics. And let the other hierarchy dictate how it matters. And I think if you look at the erosion in these sort of blue states or red states, I guess we're a red state, the erosion, the registration, there was a time when the registration was relatively close in Wyoming, but over the years, it's tough to be a Democrat in some of these places, just because, not because of what you might believe, but what people believe you believe because of the predominance of the various opinion networks one way or the other. You got to remember, I think 57% of the people in Wyoming probably get most of their news from Fox.
Wow.
But it is a wonder to me that the same people who voted for Trump voted for me.
Yeah.
Now, my daughter would suggest that may say something about me more than it should.
Anyway, this is great. So I'm going to actually turn things back to Jim, though I may chime in periodically, because I have not been looking at the question list, but he has. So why don't you call in a few people, Jim?
He unmute first, and I'm going to go ahead and leave this with David's picture spotlighted so he takes up most of the field of view. I am going to go ahead and start by going back to the list here. So first of all, I remind you that you can ask questions live, and we'll have those filtered in as we go. So let me just go back up here. And we talked a little bit about how you heard about Amherst. That answers a question on the list. And question about how many miles did David drive each year while he was governor? To talk to the people in Wyoming requires a lot of travel.
Well, I drove a lot, but I also had the benefit of a couple of jets that could get me across the state in about 54 minutes. And the legislature always would, one of my dear friends in the legislature, black-hearted Republican bugger, always complained that if anybody had a garage sale of more than 2 people, I showed up. I thought that was rude. But I think that, I don't know, it seems like hundreds of thousands of miles, but we had a security detail. So what would happen is we'd go do the events, and then I would sleep on the drive home. And so I always tried to be home by midnight. And sometimes we just stayed out on the road, because what you do is you figure out, all right, I'm going to be in this particular basin, and I got 5 or 6 things I need to do, and then you would just schedule them. And you'd be like a Fuller brush man running from place to place. And but it was good. I mean, I'm really glad I did it, and I'm really glad it's over.
Talked about some of the things that were challenges and surprises to you as governor. Fred Schneider asked, what were the things that gave you the most joy as governor?
Well, people ask that, and I don't know that you can categorize it, because it's I mean, you just have some remarkable human experiences. I mean, whether it's some little kid who's drawn a picture that he's waited for you to get to town to give to you, or if you go to some event, and well, I mean, one of the best things was when you go to a parade, because my wife and I both ride horses, but you couldn't rely on what kind of horse was going to show up. And so one of the delights was when you got a good horse. But oftentimes they'd bring a horse in, and they'd say, well, it's never been in a parade before, so we can't tell you how it's going to do. And in one particular parade, they run the cattle in front of the parade for the rodeo. And my wife's horse was a cutting horse, and decided it wasn't going to stay where we were at. It took off, lickety split, ran after the cattle all the way. So I came along behind, picking up whatever fell off the horse, and then we met up at the end of the parade. It doesn't sound like a great experience, but it was interesting. I mean, it was and you'd end up in a parade where they'd end up with a bunch of Harley Davidsons around the horses, and that caused problems. But I mean, it's an opportunity to understand the life of people whose lives are very different than your own.
Good. What lessons from growing up on the ranch most helped you adapt to Amherst and optimize your learning experience there?
Mostly stubbornness. I mean, I nearly didn't make it. I mean, I had a lot of trouble adjusting. And the thing that helped me most, frankly, was the friendships I formed with some folks, and then the ability to, of all things, to work in the kitchen at Valentine, because these were people I understood intuitively. And I would think just a sense of one way or the other, I'm going to get this done. You got a job to do, go do it.
Very good. John Schnickner says, is Dave's takeaway from the current polarized nature of political discussion that Democrats need to stop using liberal labels for current problems and instead try to explain their plans in more concrete terms that the person in the street can understand?
Absolutely. I mean, uh, um, I mean, when I got elected, they have a Democratic Governors Association, and I went to a few of them and decided I ain't wasting my time with this. You know, they want to. I mean, I'm a Democrat because I believe their intentions are good. Their ability to translate is not particularly well developed. It's always sort of profound and intellectual and sort of cocktail conversation. People don't live that way. That's not. I mean, that's not what life is about. But that's certainly the way they message. And see, and that was Trump's trick. Like him or hate him, he had the ability to be an absolute rich snob and yet develop the capacity to make the average person believe that they were sitting at his kitchen table. And much to my chagrin, it worked.
Does Wyoming have any kinetic storage options, such as pumping water into high elevation reservoirs during high generating periods and drawing it down when needed for hydroelectric generation?
Yeah, it does, and that's been looked at, and usually has run into problems with compliance with NEPA, to get through NEPA, you have to have purpose and need, and that gets to be tough in terms of essentially recycling water. Got pretty good. We've got great capacity for because of the amount of oil and gas development that's gone on in the state. We have great capacity for storage of CO2 because the pore space exists. And one of the things I did in office is we created a legal framework that settled the question about who owns the pore space. So that, there are real viable options. The problem is that most of the CO2 generating sources are such a distance from Wyoming that the cost of getting it here to secure it underground is pretty tough. So there's some, but I tell you what, doing any kind of hydro storage in a place, because remember, most of those areas are still federal land, and there's always somebody who doesn't want you to do it.
Okay. Any thoughts about how to increase COVID vaccinations in Wyoming and neighboring states?
You know, some of the companies I represent have tried everything. They've offered money. They brought the vaccination to the job site, and it is just a political statement of faith with a number of people that hell no, I'm not going to do it. And I have friends who won't do it, and frankly, I don't see them. I said, well, I'll be glad to talk to you on the phone, be glad to talk to you on Zoom, but you ain't coming to the house. It's just a choice you make. I would think that the thing that stuns me is what have we lost? I don't know, 1,500 people. 1,500 people, that's more people than are in a number of the communities in the state. And it isn't enough to have people take it seriously. And there's a, and the current governor is a friend of mine, but I disagree with him. He's gotten on the bandwagon about, no mandates, and we had a special legislative session and, a lot of breastfeeding and nothing. I think, sadly, I think it's going to take more deaths that are more intimate to people to get them to get vaccinated. Because a few people I know who've made the change, it's largely become there was a function of some personal impact on their life.
Just for the record, I checked day before yesterday. 46.2% of the Wyoming adult population is fully vaccinated, compared to 61.6 nationally. There have been 1,472 deaths in Wyoming, and 51% of the ICU beds this week in Wyoming are occupied, and 40% of those patients in the ICU beds are COVID patients.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's I mean, for basically rational people, it's an irrational fervor. I mean, I wear my mask when I go to the hardware store, and you get the snake eye from a bunch of people, but I view that as their problem, not mine.
Let's switch to a couple political questions. There's a couple here about Liz Cheney.
Yeah.
One is, do you think she'll prevail in the Republican primary? But the other is perhaps a little more broad ranging. Is what do you make of Liz Cheney and her current stand on pursuing the January 6th investigation? Does Wyoming breed sturdy individuals who think for themselves instead of going along blindly with their parties?
Yeah, it's an interesting. I mean, I actually have a lot of respect for Liz Cheney. I don't like some of her she has too many of her dad's foreign policy impulses. But I think in terms of somebody who represents the state, I think she does a great job, some of which I don't agree with, but there's a lot I don't agree with. I think she's right on January 6th. As to whether she prevails, that's a closer call. There's they went through this thing where the state party disavowed their association with her. Well, that was a 29-31 vote. And one of the people who went there went with instructions from their local party not to vote in favor of censoring her. And he flipped in the meeting. So it was a 31-29 vote, which would have been a 30-30 tie, and she wouldn't have been censored. But I think here's what I'd say. I hope that the people of Wyoming have the good sense to reelect her and reject her opponent, who's a wingnut. But I don't know how it'll sort out,
Yeah.
and I haven't seen any reliable polling, so I don't know.
One more question from the chat here. Would you be willing to lead a coalition of Western governors for Biden?
Depends on which Biden I'm dealing with. The Biden who I knew when he was vice president, and the Biden that ran for office, or the current Biden. He was a much more centrist candidate than he's turned out to be president, and I think this country needs a centrist voice. But if it's against Trump, I won't have any trouble with that. But I don't. In the end, since politics is a question of choices, the answer is probably yes. But the real problem is that how do you take the sort of logical stuff that he's doing and separate it from stuff that is designed for an audience that probably isn't here in the West.
Progressive wing.
Well, some of their stuff's okay. It's just that they don't believe it has to be paid for. And I mean, I offend all of my corporate clients by suggesting they ought to be taxed more. But I don't. What I don't get with the Democrats is the suspension of logic. Not that the Republicans are any better, but I mean, it's just tough. It's tough to belong to either of these parties at this stage.
Yeah, I'm not sure logic is at the core of politics as part of the issue. So
one would hope at least a little bit.
Yeah. Let's move on to a question from the floor. Steve Klugman has his hand raised. Steve, you have to unmute. There you go.
Hi, how are you, Dave? This question was too much typing for me, so this way. I was very interested in your suggestions for governor, partly because it's in some ways resembles some of the thoughts and frustrations I've had. But you talk about the Jeffersonian model, or people aren't just trying to get reelected. And that's just not going to work with a lot of the people who are in politics now. The
Right.
question that I don't know the answer to, but wonder if you have any thoughts about, how do you get people who aren't politicians interested in politics to serve a term as governor of a state or serve a couple of terms in the House and then walk away? You know, the people who've been doing it for 30 years aren't going to change their minds and say, hey, you know, I think I think I've had enough. You know, they have to lose an election or I don't know what the other possibility is for getting them out of there. But, you know, is there a way to involve people like that?
I don't know right now because I've had those conversations with people, frankly, of both parties who I think ought to run, and they just don't want to subject themselves or their families to it. They just, and I can understand that. I mean, you know, I mean, the environment I served in was less abusive than it is now, but we put up with plenty. And you know, with the threats and all the rest of that, and although none of the threats were as serious as the ones I encountered from the Mexican cartels when I was U.S. attorney, but I think sadly the public gets what they vote for, and if they're willing to tolerate this, I don't know. I mean, to an extent, politics is a marketplace. And what you're talking about, I'm not sure people are going to buy it. They don't want to have to think through what it means to. They want to hear 5 words in a speech and cheer. They don't want to have to think about what those 5 words would mean if they were actually put in operation.
So we're at 5 minutes after. Are there other questions, Jim?
Just one more from the chat. Bob Hicks asked, do you think Trump will run again, and will Wyoming support him?
Well, the answer to the second question is yes. As to the first question, I don't know. I mean, you know, you know, on some days I'm really optimistic that you can see people stepping up and saying, we're just not going to put up with this. But there are other days when you just think optimism is kind of misplaced. By nature, I tend to be optimistic and hopeful. So you would hope that, frankly, that Trump wouldn't run, because I mean, some of the stuff he did wasn't too bad, but there was just too much other stuff, and too much acid put into the system that I think colored the perspectives that we have today.
Wow.
Okay, very good. Let me end with two. Well, there's another question about, will you be at the reunion, David?
I haven't crossed that bridge. It frankly, I have to tell you, the most important travel we do now is to see our grandkids. We've got 8 of them, and that sort of trumps everything else.
Yeah. Okay, well, let me end with a compliment from the chap. Toporoff says, such a down-home, common sense thinker and truth teller. No wonder Dave was such a successful Democratic politician in a red state. So thank you for your transparency and your answers, directness. David Brown, any final comments?
Well, I did just 2 things. Once I get finished, if you want to unmute everyone, I don't know. I feel guilty that we've been talking for more than an hour and all of you have been unable to utter anything. So anyway, if people want to say hi to each other for a couple minutes, that's fine. But in any case, just looking forward, we're going to do this next one in March. I'm not yet at a place where I can announce the person, but that's part of the tease to get you all to come back. And you'll certainly be, you know, notified in plenty of time to fit the next interview into your busy schedules. The people, the 6 people have been chosen. We may squeeze in a seventh interview. But anyway, thank you very much for listening in, and thank Dave in particular for his time and candor, and Jim for just making this happen and keeping my clumsy hands and wooden shoes out of the machinery, because I couldn't have done it myself. So thank you. And it's great to see all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording now, and in the